The first thing Rose Bennett noticed was not the missing furniture. It was the loose floorboard beneath her mother's old bed. Her two sisters had taken the farmhouse, the horses, the good pasture, the silver serving set, and nearly every useful thing their mother had owned. Rose had been left 4 rocky acres outside Petoskey, Michigan, and a stone cabin so worn that daylight slipped through its roof. But someone had driven fresh nails around one board in that cabin. Someone who had known Rose would eventually look down. And before winter was over, what waited beneath that floor would matter more than everything her sisters had taken. 3 days earlier, Rose had stood inside her mother's kitchen with rain dripping from the hem of her coat. Her oldest sister, Margaret, sat behind the table with several papers arranged in front of her. Their middle sister, Helen, stood by the stove. Neither woman offered Rose a chair. Their mother, Abigail Bennett, had been buried that morning. The black funeral dresses had barely dried from the rain. Margaret pushed one folded deed across the table. The north parcel belongs to you. Rose looked at it, but did not touch it. The cabin? Margaret nodded. Helen lowered her face, but Rose caught the quick movement at the corner of her mouth. 4 acres of stone and birch trees. No barn, no field worth planting. A shallow well almost 200 yards from the cabin. The place had been empty for years. Their mother had received it from an uncle and had refused every offer to sell it. Margaret had always called it Abigail's useless patch of wilderness. Now it belonged to Rose. What about Mama's savings? Funeral costs. The livestock? We divided them. The house? Margaret folded her hands. It stays with me. Rose looked toward Helen. And the south field? Helen rubbed her thumb across her wedding ring. Mama wanted me to have land close to town. Rose slowly picked up the deed. Margaret watched her as if waiting for an argument. None came. That seemed to bother her more. As Rose turned toward the door, she noticed a small sheet of paper partly hidden beneath Margaret's account book. The handwriting on the exposed corner belonged to their mother. Rose stopped. What is that? Margaret's hand came down over it. Nothing. Rose looked at her sister's fingers. They had tightened against the paper. Was it from Mama? No, Helen suddenly became very interested in the fire. Rose stayed beside the door. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then she slipped the deed into her coat. All right. Margaret blinked. That was all Rose gave her. If you have ever watched someone hide something badly, you know the smallest movement can say more than a long explanation. Rose walked home carrying almost nothing. But she carried that movement with her. The following morning, she borrowed a mule and wagon from Caleb Ford, the elderly carpenter who lived behind the livery stable. By noon, the road had narrowed into 2 muddy tracks, cutting through yellowing birch. The season had begun changing early. Leaves were already dropping. Squirrels moved constantly along the ground, packing food into holes beneath roots. Rose noticed because her mother had taught her to notice. Animals read winter before people do, Abigail used to say. Rose had laughed at that when she was younger. She was not laughing now. The cabin appeared beyond a rise. One wall leaned slightly inward. Several roof shingles were missing. The chimney had lost stones around its upper edge. Rose climbed from the wagon. The clearing smelled of wet leaves and cedar. She stood facing the building while wind moved through the birch behind her. Margaret's words returned. Useless patch of wilderness. Rose walked to the cabin. The front door resisted before scraping across the floor. Dust moved through narrow shafts of afternoon light. There was one iron stove, a wooden chair, a cracked table, and a bed frame without a mattress. Almost nothing else. Rose stepped farther inside. Then, she stopped. There was a smell beneath the damp wood. Beeswax. She turned slowly. Beeswax did not belong in an abandoned cabin. Neither did the clean iron shovel resting beside the stove. Rose touched its handle. No dust. She looked toward the floor. Near the bed was a dried patch of mud shaped like the heel of a woman's boot. Rose crouched beside it. Her fingers hovered over the mark. Her mother had owned boots with that same narrow heel. Abigail had told everyone she spent her summer Sundays gathering herbs north of town. Rose had never questioned it. Now she looked around the ruined cabin again. "Why were you here, Mama?" Her own voice sounded strange inside the stone walls. Rose stood. She crossed toward the bed. That was when one floorboard moved beneath her boot. Not much, less than half an inch. But Rose felt it. She stepped back. Several boards were gray with age. One was different. Its edges had been cut clean. 4 nail heads around it were darker than the others. Newer, Rose knelt and pressed her palm against the wood. Warm air touched the skin between her fingers. She pulled her hand away. Outside, the afternoon had turned cold enough that her breath showed faintly. The air beneath the floor was warmer. Rose fetched the iron shovel. She worked its flat edge beneath the board and pushed down. The wood rose. A breath of mild, earthy air came through the opening. Rose pulled harder. The board lifted free. Darkness waited underneath. Not dirt. Empty space. She removed another plank. Then another. A wooden ladder appeared. It descended between fitted stone walls deeper than the cabin foundation should have allowed. Rose sat back on her heels. Her mother had built something beneath this place. Something Margaret and Helen apparently knew nothing about. Rose lit a lantern. She lowered one boot onto the first rung. Then, the next. With every step down, the air grew warmer. At the bottom, she raised the lantern. Shelves covered the far wall. Dozens of sealed jars stood in neat rows. Beans, apples, corn, peaches, preserves beside them rested sacks of grain, folded blankets, tools, candles, lamp oil, and bundles of dried herbs. Rose stared without blinking. Her mother's handwriting covered every label. Some dates went back nearly 5 years. 5 years of work. 5 years of secret trips into these woods. Rose touched one jar. Then she saw the notebook. It lay on a small stone shelf, wrapped in oilcloth. Her name had been written across the front. Rose, nothing else. Her fingers shook once as she loosened the wrapping. The first pages contained measurements, drawings, lists of supplies, and notes about the stone walls. She turned farther. Then, she reached the final written page. Only 4 lines waited there. Rose read them once. Then again. If they have left you the cabin, they have done exactly what I expected. Do not sell it. Find the largest oak on the eastern boundary. Dig beneath the north root before the first hard snow. Rose slowly lowered the notebook. Above her, something crossed the cabin floor. One step. Then another. Rose froze beside the ladder. She had left the front door closed. A floorboard creaked directly over her head. Then, a man's voice called down through the opening. "Miss Bennett?" Rose tightened both hands around the lantern. The voice belonged to someone she knew, someone who should not have known where she was. Rose did not answer the voice. She lowered the lantern until most of the cellar disappeared into shadow. Above her, another floorboard groaned. Miss Bennett? She knew him now. Silas Crowell. He owned the largest feed mill in Petoskey, sat on the church council, and handled private loans for half the farmers north of town. Rose climbed slowly. When her head reached floor level, she saw his polished boots beside the open boards. Silas smiled down at her. "I hope I am not interrupting." Rose climbed out and immediately pulled one loose plank over part of the opening. "What are you doing here?" Silas removed his hat. "Your sister Margaret mentioned you had taken possession." Rose kept one hand on the floorboard. That was quick. His smile held. News travels. Not this fast. For a moment, neither moved. Then Silas glanced toward the opening beneath her hand. "What have you found?" "Rot." He looked at her. Rose looked back. Silas walked toward the window instead. "I came because your mother spoke to me about this land several years ago." Rose's fingers tightened around the lantern handle. "What did she say?" "That someday it might be useful." "For what?" She never explained. Silas turned. "If the place becomes too much for you, I would buy it." Rose almost laughed. Yesterday her sisters had treated 4 acres of rock as punishment. Today one of the richest men in town had ridden several miles to offer money for it. How much? $50. Rose looked around the cabin, the damaged roof, the leaning door, the cracked stove. Then she looked down at the hidden opening. No. Silas's jaw shifted slightly. 100. "No, think before answering. I already did." Silas put his hat back on. At the doorway, he stopped. "Your mother had strange ideas about this property." Rose said nothing. He looked over his shoulder. Strange ideas can become expensive. Then he walked outside. Rose remained still until the sound of his horse disappeared through the trees. Only then did she close the door. She returned to the cellar. The notebook lay where she had left it. Rose opened it again. This time she read slowly. Her mother had recorded temperatures. January, February, March. No matter how hard the freezes came above ground, the cellar rarely dropped below 47 degrees. Rose followed a drawing toward the rear wall. There, behind 2 barrels, she found a narrow channel carved into the stone. Clear water moved through it. She touched the surface. Not warm. Not cold either. A steady underground spring. That water explained the mild air beneath the floor. Abigail had not simply found a hole in the earth. She had studied it, measured it, built around it. Rose sat beside the channel until the lantern flame shortened. Near sunset, another knock came. This one was different. 2 quick taps. Then, 1. Rose opened the door holding the iron shovel. An older woman stood outside. Her name was Martha Hale. Rose remembered her from church. 70 years old. Narrow shoulders. White hair beneath a dark wool bonnet. Martha looked at the shovel. "Good," Rose frowned. "Good? Your mother always said you would answer a strange knock with something heavy in your hand." Rose lowered the shovel slightly. "You knew my mother?" Martha stepped inside. "I knew what she did when everyone else thought she was gathering herbs." Rose closed the door. Martha looked toward the replaced floorboards. "You found it." Rose did not answer. The older woman removed her gloves. "I carried half those jars down that ladder." Rose stared at her. Martha gave a tired little smile. "Your mother was terrible at asking for help. Fortunately, I was terrible at waiting to be asked." They went below. Martha touched the stone wall as if greeting an old friend. She showed Rose marks cut beside the shelves. 1 mark for every winter Abigail had worked there. 5 lines. She wanted this place ready for bad weather. Martha said. "For us? For anyone who needed a door that could stay shut." Rose looked at the food. Why would anyone need to hide here? Martha's eyes moved toward the ladder. Because sometimes the danger outside a house wears a wedding ring. Rose did not speak. Martha pulled a folded scrap from her coat. 7 women's names were written on it. Some Rose knew. One had disappeared from town 4 years earlier. Another had suddenly moved west with 2 children. A third had once arrived at church, with her arm tied against her ribs. "Your mother helped them leave," Martha said. Rose read the names again. She built this for them. She built it because she learned that a warm room can be worth more than money when someone has nowhere else to go. Martha began checking the jars. Then she stopped at one shelf. Her hand hovered over an empty space. "There should be another box here." "What box?" "Papers," Rose turned. "What papers?" Martha looked toward the ceiling. "Names, dates, men your mother did not trust." Rose thought of Silas Crowell standing above the open floor. Her stomach tightened. Did Silas know about this place? Martha's mouth became a hard line. Your mother believed someone had been watching her last spring. Outside, the wind struck the cabin wall. The lantern flame leaned inside its glass. For the next 3 weeks, Rose worked from sunrise until her hands stopped closing properly. Caleb Ford came north with tools. He replaced broken roof shakes. Rose mixed lime mortar and packed it between loose stones. She sealed the north wall with clay. She repaired the chimney. She cut firewood until her palms split beneath her gloves. Each evening she climbed underground and read another section of Abigail's notebook. And each evening the weather changed. Birds vanished early. Squirrels stopped wandering. The first frost arrived before October was half gone. If survival ever begins quietly, it often begins with small work nobody notices. One sealed crack, one dry blanket, one extra sack of grain. Rose kept working. Then, on October 19, a horse came hard up the road. A young county deputy named Thomas Reed dismounted before the animal had fully stopped. He did not remove his gloves. Rose Bennett? Yes, he pulled a folded document from inside his coat. I was hoping to reach you before they did. Rose looked toward the road. Before who? Thomas handed her the paper. It was a petition filed with the county court. Rose read the first line. Then, the second. Her face went still. The petition claimed she was incapable of managing property on her own. It requested that a legal guardian be appointed, and if approved, that guardian would control the cabin and the land beneath it. Rose looked at the names attached as witnesses. Silas Crowell, 2 church elders, and at the bottom, written clearly in familiar handwriting, Margaret Bennett, her own sister. Thomas looked past Rose toward the cabin. They are coming tomorrow morning to take possession. Rose folded the paper once. Then, she turned toward the eastern woods, toward the largest oak. Her mother had told her to dig before the first hard snow. Rose grabbed the shovel from beside the door. The first flakes began falling before she reached the trees. Snow gathered in Rose Bennett's hair before she reached the oak. The tree stood near the eastern edge of the property, wider than the others, its roots pushing through the rocky ground like old knuckles. Rose dropped to her knees. She dug beside the north root. The first inch was soft. Then, the shovel struck frozen soil. Thomas Reed came behind her carrying a lantern. You have less than an hour of light. Rose did not stop. My mother told me to dig here. Thomas looked back toward the cabin. And tomorrow men with papers will be standing at your door. That is why I am digging. The shovel hit something solid. Not stone. Metal. Rose scraped away the dirt. A narrow tin box appeared beneath the root, wrapped in oilcloth blackened by years underground. She pulled it free. Her fingers had gone numb. They carried it back to the cabin. Martha was waiting inside. When she saw the box, she sat down without removing her coat. So she finished it. Rose placed the box on the table. You knew about this? I knew she was hiding something. Thomas shut the door behind them. Rose cut the old twine. Inside were 23 folded letters, a small ledger, 3 signed statements, and 1 sealed envelope with Rose's name across the front. She opened the ledger first. Each page held dates, payments, land offers, meetings. Silas Crowell's name appeared again and again. Beside several entries were notes in Abigail's handwriting. Asked again about the spring. Offered $75. Followed me north. Spoke with Margaret. Then Rose found the name of a businessman from Detroit, Nathaniel Pike. According to Abigail's notes, Pike had been buying land across northern Michigan, wherever natural underground water kept cellars stable through winter. Cold storage, breweries, meat houses, fruit warehouses, Rose turned a page. At the bottom, Abigail had written one sentence. Silas does not want the cabin. He wants what is under it. Thomas leaned closer. He knew. Martha nodded, or suspected enough to gamble on it. Rose opened one of the signed statements. A woman named Caroline Mercer had described Silas offering her husband money for information about Abigail's movements. Another statement came from a farmhand who had seen Silas near the cabin after midnight. The third was from Abigail herself. Rose read it twice. Then she handed it to Thomas. He read silently. His jaw tightened. "What?" Martha asked. Thomas placed the paper flat. "Your mother believed Silas intended to have her declared incapable before she died." Rose looked toward him. "He was trying this before me?" "Yes," Thomas tapped the statement. "She wrote that he had been collecting witnesses for nearly a year." Rose's eyes moved toward the sealed letter addressed to her. She opened it last. "My dear Rose, if you are reading this, then the land has already become dangerous. Not because of the stone, because someone has finally understood its value. Do not waste your strength arguing with people who have already chosen what they want to believe. Take the ledger to Judge Arthur Bell in Lansing. Do not give the original to anyone else. Trust actions more than titles. And Rose, if winter arrives before the law does, open the cellar. There may be people who need it more than you." Rose stopped reading. Martha's hands were folded tightly in her lap. Thomas looked toward the window. Snow crossed the glass almost sideways. "What does she mean by open the cellar?" Rose asked. Martha stared at the table. "Your mother expected a bad winter. That does not answer me." Martha lifted her face. She had names. "How many?" "I never knew the final number." Rose looked at the 23 letters in the box. Each envelope carried a woman's name. Some addresses were in town. Others were farms scattered miles apart. Thomas reached for his coat. "I can take the ledger south tonight." Rose looked outside. "You will not make Lansing in this. I can make the rail station. No, if Silas takes possession tomorrow, this may be the only evidence that stops him." Rose placed both palms on the box. "Then, we make copies." Thomas stared at her. "Tonight?" "Yes," Martha stood. "I know 3 women in town who write faster than either of you." For 4 hours, the cabin became a small office. Martha read. Thomas copied. Rose sorted dates and names. They made 2 full copies of the ledger and wrapped the original in oilcloth. Near midnight, hoofbeats approached. Thomas stood immediately. He reached beneath his coat. Rose extinguished one lamp. The knock came hard. Not polite. 3 blows against the door. Rose opened it only a few inches. Margaret stood outside. Snow clung to her bonnet. Her face looked gray. Helen was behind her, bent against the wind. Rose said nothing. Margaret swallowed. "Silas lied to me." Rose kept her hand on the door. Margaret held up a folded paper. "He said the statement I signed would help the court protect you." Rose looked at it. "You signed anyway." Margaret lowered her eyes. "Yes," Helen stepped forward. "We found something." Rose's grip tightened. "In Mama's desk." Margaret opened her coat and removed a half-burned sheet of paper. One edge was black. Several lines were missing. But Abigail's handwriting remained. Rose took it. The surviving words were enough. "Silas knows about the spring. He has offered Margaret money without telling her why. If anything happens to me, do not let him control the North Land." Rose slowly raised her eyes. Margaret's lips trembled once. "He offered me $200 after the funeral." Thomas moved closer. "For what?" Margaret stared at the floor. "To convince Rose to sell." Wind pushed snow through the crack in the doorway. Rose's face barely moved. "Did you take it?" Margaret shook her head. "No." Then she reached into her pocket. "But I kept this." A second paper. A private purchase agreement. Silas Crowell had promised to sell the Bennett property to Nathaniel Pike for $3,000. The agreement was dated 6 weeks before Abigail died. Thomas read the page. "This is enough." "For what?" Rose asked. "To stop the guardianship." Margaret looked toward her younger sister. "I will testify." Rose said nothing. "I will tell the judge I signed the statement because Silas lied about what it was." Still, Rose did not move. Helen touched Margaret's arm. Then came another sound outside. Not hoofbeats, wagon wheels. Several horses. Thomas moved toward the window. Lanterns appeared between the trees. 5, then 6. Men were coming up the road. Margaret's face drained of color. He was not supposed to come until morning. Thomas stepped away from the window. He changed his mind. Rose looked toward the floor, toward the cellar beneath them, then toward the 23 letters on the table. Snow struck the roof harder. A man shouted outside. "Rose Bennett, open this door under authority of the county court." Thomas reached for the lantern. Rose reached for the iron bar, and beneath their boots, warm air continued rising through the cracks in the floor. The first man through the snow carried a folded court paper. Silas Crowell walked behind him. His coat was buttoned to the throat. Snow clung to the brim of his black hat. 4 other men followed with lanterns. One carried a pry bar. Another led an empty wagon. Rose noticed that wagon first. They had not come merely to speak with her. They had come prepared to remove her. Thomas Reed stepped onto the porch. "The petition has not been approved." The man holding the paper stopped. Silas kept walking. "It was signed this afternoon." Thomas held out his hand. "Then let me see it." Silas did not move. Rose stood behind Thomas. Margaret and Helen remained near the table. The tin box rested between them. Silas looked past Rose toward the floor. For 1 second, his eyes settled on the boards covering the cellar. That was enough. Rose saw it. You knew exactly where it was. Silas looked back at her. "I know what?" "The spring." Wind pushed snow across the porch. Nobody spoke. Rose stepped beside Thomas. "My mother knew you were following her." Silas's face stayed flat. "She wrote down every visit, every offer, every man you paid." One of the men behind Silas glanced toward him. Rose continued. "She also kept your agreement with Nathaniel Pike." Silas blinked. Barely, but Margaret saw it too. She stepped forward. "I have the agreement." Silas turned toward her. "You should go home." Margaret's shoulders pulled back. No, it was one small word. Rose had heard Margaret order people around her entire life. She had almost never heard her refuse a man like Silas. Not quietly. Not without explaining herself. Silas pointed toward Thomas. "This is county business." Thomas finally took the paper from the other man. He opened it beneath the porch lantern. His eyes moved across the page. Then stopped. "This is not a possession order." Silas said nothing. Thomas turned the sheet around. "This authorizes an examination hearing next week." Nothing more. The man who had carried it looked toward Silas. "You said we were taking the property tonight." Silas's mouth tightened. "I said the court had acted." "No," Thomas replied. "You said Rose Bennett had been removed as owner." The men behind him began shifting their weight. One lowered the pry bar. Silas saw them pulling away from him. His voice sharpened. "You were paid to do a job." Rose looked toward the empty wagon. What were they supposed to load? Silas did not answer. The jars? Nothing? The tools? Nothing. Or were they supposed to tear up the floor until they found the water? Silas stepped toward her. Thomas moved between them. "Stay where you are." For the first time, Silas raised his voice. "That property will be useless in 10 years. Pike can develop it. He can bring money into this county." Rose looked at the snow piling along the porch. "My mother said the same land was worthless whenever anyone asked." Silas's breathing had changed. shorter now. Steam pushed from his mouth. Rose held out her hand. Margaret placed the purchase agreement into it. Rose showed Silas his own signature. You planned to sell something you did not own. Silas reached for the paper. Thomas caught his wrist. Everything happened quickly after that. Silas jerked backward. One boot slipped from the porch. He struck the railing hard enough to crack it. Thomas twisted his arm behind him. The other men did not help Silas. They stepped away. Within a minute, the man who had arrived expecting to take Rose's cabin was sitting inside his own wagon with his wrists tied. Thomas looked toward Rose. I need the original ledger. She shook her head. You get a copy tonight. Thomas almost smiled. Your mother taught you well. No, Silas did. She closed the door. The storm worsened before midnight. By morning, the road had disappeared. Snow reached the lower window frame. The cabin groaned whenever the wind struck from the north. Rose, Margaret, Helen, and Martha moved below the floor. Thomas returned before the road vanished completely. He had delivered Silas to the jail and brought Caleb Ford back with him. 6 people now occupied the hidden room. The cellar that had looked enormous when Rose first discovered it suddenly felt small. They rationed lamp oil. They heated beans over a small iron burner. They melted snow upstairs whenever the wind eased enough for someone to reach the door. The underground spring kept moving beside them. Its temperature did not change. On the second night, Helen woke coughing. Her hands would not stop shaking. Martha wrapped her in 2 wool blankets and moved her closer to the warm stone. Margaret sat beside her until sunrise. She held the cup every time Helen drank. Rose watched from across the cellar. Neither sister mentioned the farmhouse. Neither mentioned land. Neither mentioned who had received what. Outside, the storm stripped branches from the trees. Inside, Margaret spent 3 hours feeding tiny pieces of cedar into the burner because Helen could not get warm enough. That was when Rose understood what her mother had prepared for. Not one person. Not one daughter. Whoever reached the ladder. By the 4th day, food began disappearing faster than Rose liked. She counted the jars twice. Caleb watched her. We have enough. For 6. Yes, what if someone else comes? Caleb looked toward the ladder. Then came the pounding. Everyone went quiet. 3 strikes against the cabin door. Then, 2 more. Rose climbed. Snow burst inward when she opened it. A woman stood outside with a boy pressed against her coat. Behind them was an older man leaning heavily on a broken walking stick. Their wagon had overturned nearly 2 miles north. The boy's cheeks had gone pale. Rose looked back at the floor. At the cellar. At the supplies her mother had spent years gathering. Then she opened the door wider. Get inside. 2 more travelers arrived the following evening. By the time the storm finally weakened, 11 people were living beneath the cabin. The last jar of peaches was opened on the morning sunlight returned. Rose divided it into 11 small portions. Nobody complained. When they finally climbed outside, the forest looked unfamiliar. Snow buried fences. Birch trees had snapped under the weight. A section of Rose's roof was gone. The chimney leaned. But the cabin still stood. Weeks later, Judge Arthur Bell dismissed the petition against Rose. Margaret testified about Silas's lies. Thomas submitted the ledger. Nathaniel Pike denied knowing how Silas planned to obtain the property and withdrew from the purchase. Silas faced charges connected to fraud and forged statements. Rose never saw him on her land again. Spring reached northern Michigan slowly. One April morning, Rose carried her mother's tin box to the largest oak. Margaret and Helen walked beside her. The 3 sisters sat beneath bare branches. Rose opened the remaining letters. 23 names. 23 people Abigail had intended to reach. Margaret picked up the first envelope. Helen took the second. Rose took the third. They walked toward town together. Behind them, beneath the repaired cabin floor, clear water continued slipping through the stone channel exactly as it had before anyone knew it was there. And beside the ladder, Rose left the lantern filled. If stories like Rose Bennett's deserve to be remembered, subscribe and like so more frontier stories can keep finding their way to you.